All right, thank you, Philip. Good morning. Great to see each of you here today. If you want to turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel, that's where we're going to be this morning. Granted, it'll take us just a few minutes to get to the actual text as we're kind of introducing the book of 1 Samuel as we're entering into a new study here, a new quarter here in the auditorium. 1 Samuel is a fascinating book, and actually we'll make this point in just a second. The first half of a fascinating book that talks about this search for a king and talks about some of the most important moments in Israelite history. And as we'll see throughout this morning's class, and also as we go into other classes, other portions of 1 Samuel, we'll see that the story that is told here is a story that the New Testament points back to regularly as we think about Jesus as king, and we'll say more about that in just a little while. I want to start this morning by talking to you about what it is in front of us, 1 Samuel, what we call 1 Samuel. When we think about 1 and 2 Samuel, because we have them divided into two sections here in our Bibles, we sometimes associate them with being two books. In actuality, the book of Samuel in the Hebrew Bible is one book, but it's divided into two parts largely because of the sheer length of the book. It would be very difficult to fit 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel together on the same scroll or something of that nature. And so 1 Samuel is really, should be known to us really as Samuel Part 1 rather than 1 Samuel. You see the difference there in the way that we think about it. When we hear 1 Samuel, we think this is the first book Samuel wrote. What would be the problem with that if we thought about that in terms of 2 Samuel? Who's dead by 2 Samuel's coming? Samuel, right? So it's not the second book Samuel wrote unless he did a lot more when Saul called him up out of the grave than engage Saul. Maybe he pinned 2 Samuel real quick prophetically. But no, this is one part of a much bigger story, 1 and 2 Samuel together. The second thing is that the book is anonymous like many of the Old Testament books. It does not have a signature on it that says, I, Samuel, am writing to you the words that are on this page, especially in 2 Samuel, as we just laughed about. The book's anonymous, and likely, based on the tradition that was handed down among the Jews, it probably was the work of multiple authors. Many of the Jews believed that Samuel did write most of 1 Samuel up until the point of his death, and then other prophets took up the task and continued to tell the story, and that may well be the case. There are several books in the Old Testament that are written by and put together by more than one author. We think about the book of Proverbs, the book of Psalms, even the book of Jeremiah to some degree. He talks about Baruch and all of that. But if you look at the book of Proverbs, does Solomon write all the Proverbs? No. There's Proverbs that belong to other authors. Think about Psalms. How many years are covered in the book of Psalms? Well, nobody really knows for sure when the last psalm was written or the first psalm was written, but we do know that David didn't write the book of Psalms, right? There are many other psalms there that come from people later and all of that. So there were people involved in putting these books together as well. So we don't know for sure the details on exactly who wrote 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and how that came to be. What we do know is that Israel and later the church viewed the book of Samuel together as being part of the inspired Word of God. And so we're not going to belabor that. We will treat it as such in our discussion. Third thing here, and want to make this point more than any of the others, is the basic plot of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel revolves around the theme of kingship. It's all about Israel's search for a king. Now, if you'll recall, Israel was in a state of relative anarchy when we conclude the book of Judges. By the way, chronologically, in your Bible, you have Ruth between Judges and Samuel, but really, chronologically, Samuel is coming right after Judges, right? Judges 21, the ending there. In Judges 21, verse 25, this final note in the story up to Samuel, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What do we learn about the state of Israel from this reflection here in Judges 21, 25? And I'm asking you, what might we glean from the state of affairs? Or concerning the state of affairs, I should say. It's chaotic. There's no person that is consistently mediating the reign of God among the people. What else? What would be another adjective beyond chaotic that we could give to the state of affairs?
They were doing what was right in their own eyes. They weren't trying to do what was right in God's eyes or anybody else's eyes, or necessarily it was like one, like, it's all for me, everything's for me.
Chaotic and sinful, right? I mean, there's a pride that is at play, and the story of Judges is really largely centered on the need for something better, right? There's nobody reads Judges and goes, this is how God wanted it to be in Israel forever, was to have this cycle of absolute immorality, sinfulness, punishment from some outside nation, appealing to God, the intervention of a judge, and rinse and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. Judges is not a positive book about how the people of Israel are functioning, and it really all comes to the conclusion in verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. It gives us the indication that the author of Judges is using the book of Judges to illustrate that Israel actually had a need for something better. They had a need for some king of some kind. So, as the first point there said, we've already said that, Israel was in a state of anarchy, lacking leadership. And in 1 Samuel, what we find is that Israel is going to demand a king from Samuel, a king like the other nations. Specifically, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but specifically, what Israel is looking for is they really want to delegate to the king the responsibility for taking care of Israel, and they want to resign themselves. So they say, we want somebody to have a standing army ready to defend us. We're tired of going to battle. Let the army go to battle. We want somebody who's going to be the representative of the people in the same way that the nations have their representatives. We're going to say more about this when we get to chapter 8. But there is a little bit of half-truth involved in, or myth maybe, involved in the way that the story of Israel's acquisition of a king is sometimes told. Many people, maybe this is the way you grew up thinking about it, there's this idea that God did not want Israel to ever have a king, but because of their insistence, gave them a king. We're going to find that that's not exactly the case. In Deuteronomy 17, Moses anticipated Israel having a king. So it's not something that God didn't already know was going to happen. And furthermore, the whole point in Samuel about talking about their quest for a king is to show that they needed a king, but they needed a specific kind of king. a king not like Saul, but like David. Actually, a king better than David. And so that is why, and again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but that is why in the New Testament, Jesus is presented by the gospel writers not as someone who says, Israel was never supposed to have a king, so I'm going to put it back. But he's going to be the fulfillment of the need for a king. He's going to be not David, but the far better David. And we'll see how that interplays as we go throughout our study. As a result, though, I just want to make this point. As a result, the story of Samuel is a story that is really, you could say, Christological in terms of its implications for the New Testament. In the New Testament, we find Jesus as the king that is far better than King David, and the New Testament is routinely connecting the story of Israel's quest for a king with the arrival of Jesus as the Christ. Even the language of calling Jesus the Christ or the Messiah is the language of Samuel. Because you remember, when God rejected Saul's kingship, he commissioned Samuel to do what to David? Anoint him, right? Anoint him. And that's where this whole idea of Jesus as the anointed one, the Christ, is coming from. It's coming from calling back all of this story of the kingship of David. And so, I don't have this on the slide, but if you look at, for instance, Acts chapter 2, and you think about Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, notice how he's going to characterize the relationship between Jesus and David. I'm not going to read you the whole thing because he's going to talk in verse 25 about this quotation of David saying, I saw the Lord, he's before me, all of that. But in verse 29 he said, brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn an oath with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, the anointed one, the King, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up. What Jesus? The Jesus that David predicted would be a descendant on his throne. That's the argument that Peter makes, connecting the story of Jesus, extremely tightly with the story of Samuel. So, that's what we'll say by way of introduction about our book today. I'll give you an opportunity to ask a question or to make a comment, and then we'll get on to the actual text of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1 is a story of, basically the way I've titled it, it's the birth of Israel's last judge. Now it's really interesting with Samuel. Samuel, for Israel, functions in a prophetic way. He functions in a judicial way. And he, in some way, functions in a royal way, not as a king, but as the one who anoints the king. But Samuel has kind of a dual office of priest and prophet, and we see that in the way that priest, prophet, and judge, as we'll see throughout his life. Nevertheless, it's the birth of Israel's final judge and this prophet that's going to have such an impact on the nation. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to have the text up here as we read through sections at a time. But then it'd be much better if you had your own Bible open, because I'm not going to constantly be putting verses on the slides as we discuss them. You can look at the text yourself. I'm using the ESV. I'm looking literally at the same Bible that's in the pew, so if you want to look at that, you can. You get on your phone, your tablet, your own personal Bible, whatever the case might be. We're going to begin by looking at these first 8 verses. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Joram, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Epaphrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? This is the first section of this sort of drama that unfolds surrounding these 3 individuals. I'm going to refer to these first 8 verses, thinking of it through the lens of a dysfunctional triangle between Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah. And we'll get into why we think of it in those terms in just a second. I want to first make a little comment here. Elkanah's lineage being recorded here probably indicates that his family was of some kind of importance. You can compare this in 1 Chronicles 6, and you can see that Elkanah's family descended from the Levitical priests in some sense, specifically those who were looking after the Ark of the Covenant. So Elkanah probably comes from a fairly important family, and as you see here through the story, a family committed to worshiping God, to seeking God, those kinds of things. So there's a lot to be commended. But our story begins with a significant, well, 2 significant indicators that conflict is around the corner in verse 2. What are those 2? Anytime you see these 2 things or one of these 2 things in the biblical narrative, I don't know of a situation where it is not the cause of conflict in the story. What would those 2 things be? Polygamy. And what's the second thing? Barrenness. Yeah, children, or the struggle of having a child. And usually okay, well, let me just say it this way. This story in 1 Samuel 1, you should read it and the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel side by side, because there's so much overlap here. And they had a dysfunctional triadic relationship, if you want to think about it like that. There was a dysfunctional triangle for Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, and it is for Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah as well. So, sociologists, psychologists, counselors, anybody in that kind of profession, they talk a significant amount about the dysfunctional nature or tendency of triangular relationships, where you have 3 unique parties with their own interests and in different relationships of power and all of that. There's oftentimes in a relationship like that, there's oftentimes shifting alliances. 2 of the 3 members come closer together on various things to gain the power of where the whole is moving. There's often manipulation as people are trying, one of the parties or 2 or 3 of the parties are attempting to gain control and power and all of those things. What I'd like for you to see as we look at the story of Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah is that each member of the triangle is looking in a different direction for meaning and happiness. And I'll put it, I mean, you can visualize this yourself, but I put it up there. But I just want you to notice the unique perspective of each of these 3 individuals. Hannah, we'll start with Hannah. Hannah, like basically every woman in the ancient world or ancient Near Eastern world, she was looking to motherhood as being, very important. But as we see in Hannah's case, as really core to her identity. She was unable to have children, as verse 2 says, And because of that, she was thrown into an identity crisis. What is my life if I cannot have children? That was her attitude. If you look at verse 7, she is depicted as weeping and not eating. This is a way of describing Hannah in very, powerful imagery to show that it's not just something that Hannah is struggling with, something that she wishes was different. There are many things that people wish were different about their life in one way or another. But this is something that has threatened the very lens through which Hannah views her life as having purpose, having meaning, having significance. We'll come back to that. Elkanah, her husband, was just like Jacob in the fact that he was looking to Hannah to give him his identity, meaning, satisfaction, all of those kinds of things. If you notice in verse 5, like Jacob, what was Elkanah doing in relation to Peninnah and Hannah? Favoritism toward Hannah. He was giving her double portion, even though she actually had no children that needed the food, right? So he was giving Peninnah, here's your portion. I'm glad that he was doing that. But then he's saying, and Hannah, I'm going to give you even more than you need. And so he shows favoritism to Hannah. Well, why do you show favoritism to somebody? Because you're looking to them to give you something, right? You're looking for, my happiness, my joy is tied up in your sentiment toward me. Just like Jacob's was tied up with Joseph and Rachel and so forth. So, if you look at verse 8, you find him expressing this from his heart. Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Those are three great questions. The problem is in verse 4, he asks a question that indicates how he views, what he views the solution to Hannah's distress to be. He doesn't say, let's seek the Lord. He doesn't say, baby, your identity doesn't have to be linked solely to your ability to have children. What does he do? He said, am I not more to you than 10 sons? So he's looking at himself and saying, I love you. Can't my love sustain you like your love? I'm looking to your love to sustain me. Now you think about Peninnah. Peninnah, like Leah before her, by the way, I should have said Hannah was like Rachel in this sense because Rachel was in a similar situation, unable to have children and had her own crisis of identity around that. Peninnah, like Leah before her, was looking at Elkanah for her identity. So in a sense, you have Hannah looking to this over here, this concept of motherhood. Elkanah is looking at Hannah. Peninnah is looking at Elkanah. And to some degree, these two are looking at each other, but in this case, they're looking at each other with contempt. Peninnah is looking at Elkanah for her identity. She's not favored by her husband. And so she torments Hannah as a way of trying to bring her down and perhaps elevate her own status in the household. They're described in terms of rivalry in verse 6. Her rival used to provoke her. Rival for what? Her husband's affection, right? The rivalry is centered around Elkanah and Elkanah's favor. And she was losing in that battle. And if you want to have your heart broken, you can read about Leah in relation to Jacob because she fought that same battle. Now, here, all of this is to say, the irony in these first 8 verses is that Peninnah had what Hannah wanted. Right? Peninnah had children. Hannah had what Peninnah wanted, the affection of her husband. And Elkanah had what he wanted from Peninnah, but he didn't want it from Peninnah, he wanted it from Hannah. So you can see that they each had what the other wanted, and they wanted what the other had. But I think maybe we could make this point even more clearly. Each of these three ultimately were looking to a human relationship to provide what only God could truly provide. Each of them was looking to another to provide some kind of identity and ultimate meaning and satisfaction that only God was able to provide. And you see this dysfunctional relationship taking place. Now, I'll just make this point of application. I'll make it again at the end. This happens in our lives constantly. You don't have to be married to two women to have this problem, okay? We are constantly looking to other people and other things to provide what only God can provide. And that path always leads to conflict. It always leads to dissatisfaction and struggle. So, what's the solution in our story going to be? We're going to find out in verse 9. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. We'll come back to that in a second. Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. Now, there's so much here. I'll keep reading. I was going to stop and make a reflection on Eli, but she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. That is the conclusion that is the basis for this thought right here, transformed through prayer. That's how I would categorize these next 10 verses or so, 9 verses. Despite the dysfunction of this triangular relationship, the family was still seeking God. Year by year, they were going up to the temple, as we find in verse 3. And Hannah goes to the temple, to the tabernacle, but it's referred to as the temple in Samuel, and was praying there. Now, I got to say this about Eli really quickly. This passage foreshadows something about Eli's household and Eli's character. The priest and judge of Israel cannot distinguish between drunkenness and prayer. Now, I know she was not speaking audibly like most people back then would have been when they were praying. She was just moving her lips. But what you're going to find out in 1 Samuel is that Eli's household has gotten so far off of spiritual discernment and wisdom and holiness. This is not supposed to be a flattering thing to Eli. He cannot discern between drunkenness and the agony of prayer, and that's a significant problem. Anyway, we move on. Eli blesses her in verse 17 after she makes her promise to God. But what I want you to see is something has happened in Hannah's heart in her encounter with God that we find revealed in her vow, and more importantly, we find revealed in her disposition at the end of this section in verse 18. Up until this point, Hannah has been in absolute despair because her identity is solely focused on being a mother. But what we find in Hannah's prayer to God is that suddenly she's vowing that if God gives her what she most wants, she will give what she most wants away to God. In other words, she's promising God that she'll leave the boy in the tabernacle, in the temple, and will she's literally promising to only be able to periodically see her child. And we're going to find that to be the case later in the story. What has happened in Hannah's heart? I would suggest to you that Hannah has removed motherhood as her ultimate purpose and therefore her idol, and has learned to align her heart by putting God back in the primary seat of authority. And the reason I say that something has changed about her sense of self-identity comes from that final remark in verse 18. Let your servant find favor in your eyes. And then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Was she pregnant in verse 18? No. Did she know that she was going to have a child in verse 18? No. So something happened in prayer in Hannah's life where suddenly she was weeping and not eating because she couldn't have a child, and now she still doesn't have a child, but she's happy and eating. What happened? She got rid of an idol in her heart. And far be it from us to think that motherhood and fatherhood cannot seriously challenge us in making it into our idol. It is the same even today. But she's realigned her priorities and values, and therefore she's had her joy restored to her. This is a common biblical principle that when we receive good things from God as blessings, our life is better. But when we turn our blessings into our idols, our life unravels. And the challenge is receiving what is good as a blessing and not promoting it to the seat of our identity. Okay. We're going quickly here, I know, but we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we sort of bring the story the whole way. The resolution to our story is largely found in these two verses. It's the answer of her prayer. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked him from the Lord. Again, you notice in verse 19 the emphasis on the family being a family of worshipers. And this is going to be an important note in Samuel's own life. He's going to be a person who is centered, his life is centered on worshiping God as well. But God answers Hannah's prayer, and she gives birth to Samuel. Now, Samuel's name has two purposes. On the one hand, she names Samuel Samuel because it says, I've asked him from the Lord. But in the book of Samuel, Israel is going to ask from the Lord for a king, right? And so you're already getting some preparation for where this story is going. But she asks him from the Lord, and she receives him. She's made a vow. I'm going to give this son away. If I ever get a son, I'm going to basically not have a son, right? I'm just going to watch him from afar. He's not going to really be my son. I'm giving him away. And she receives a son. What would the temptation be? Forget about that vow, right? How many people have engaged in bargaining with God in prayer, only to have a prayer answered and say, oh yeah, did I pledge that? I forgot. So in the case of Hannah, she makes good on her vow. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer the Lord the yearly sacrifice to pay his vow. Hannah did not go up. And maybe for a second you're thinking, she's not going to make good on this. No. She said to her husband, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. He's going to have a new house, not my house. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So he's reminding her, hey, we've got a commitment here, and we're going to see this through. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. By the way, the tabernacle was at Shiloh during this time. And the child was young. Okay, this note right here is intended to remind you that she did not wait until she was not weaning him at the age of 15, right, or at the age of 20, saying she made good on her promise to God. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Hannah goes on and prays and sings. "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like you, for there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance, not arrogance, come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Okay. Hannah's response is to fulfill her vow, to obey, and to give praise to God. Now, in our last couple minutes here, I just want to make a couple of very quick notes. The first thing is I want you to see that Samuel as a book is organized around or bookended by Hannah's song of praise, Hannah's prayer, and in 2 Samuel 22, verse 51, you get a complementary prayer and reflection. And I'll show you that here. Hannah says, "The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." There's no king in Israel yet, right? This is anticipating what's coming in the story. And then in 2 Samuel, at the end of the story, he gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing kindness, to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. So now at the end, we know who we're talking about here, David. But both of them speak of this king who is either coming or this king who has come. So, Hannah's prayer, Hannah's response, Hannah's fulfillment plays a significant role in the story that goes beyond simply her personal prayer, but also really is one of the themes of her prayer are largely what the story of Samuel is all about. But there's another connection to Hannah's prayer. You probably know this. Does Hannah's prayer remind you of another woman in the Bible who had a similar prayer? Who would give birth to the descendant of David, who would be king of kings? Mary, right? Mary? Sometimes we refer to Mary's prayer in the Gospel of Luke as the Magnificat because of the first word in the song or the prayer. But I'll just show you here the comparison. Both of them begin by saying essentially the same thing. They use different terminology. Obviously, Luke is written in Greek and Samuel in Hebrew. But my heart exults in the Lord. My soul magnifies the Lord. Both of these women pray similar prayers that talk about the Lord regarding those who are downtrodden, the Lord acting in justice toward his people, the Lord reigning and ruling, and all of those kinds of things. And so what we see in looking at the way that Mary's prayer functions, what we see is that Luke is calling from the very beginning in the Gospel of Luke He's calling us into the story of Israel's need for that ultimate king who's going to be anointed and who's going to mediate the rule of God to God's people. And so this story of the gospel, is a story that we're finding foreshadowed at every turn in the book of Samuel. So let's close by reminding us of this simple point today. Am I looking to anything other than God to provide me with what only God can provide? That would be the question that I would ask you as we think about 1 Samuel 1 and the first half of 1 Samuel 2. Next week, we're going to talk about a leadership crisis, 1 Samuel 2:12 through the end of chapter 3. But here we pause and we just call ourselves to internal reflection, prayerful reflection, and say, what am I looking to other than God to provide me with what only God can provide? It happens subtly, perhaps, but the impact of that can be seen in our life. We can actually look at our life right now, probably, and see some areas where things are not going quite the way that they ought to go in terms of our attitude, our relationships, our words, whatever the case might be. And a lot of that conflict may center upon the fact that we're looking to something other than God to provide us with only what God only can provide. So Samuel, as a book, is a book that prompts us to reflect on Jesus as the anticipated king, but it is filled with these moments of personal reflection where we can find ourselves really at the throne of God in prayer and asking God to reveal to us the ways in which we can learn from these characters, both their mistakes and their successes. That's the time that we have for this morning. We'll look forward to picking up again next week. But hope you've enjoyed the first chapter or two of Samuel, and we'll look forward to several more to come.